Nadia Ose had 14 seconds to decide whether the man bleeding out on the floor of a cold storage facility in Portsmouth Harbor was going to live or die. Constable spoke. The people who had just escorted her there at gunpoint were the same people who had handed her a termination letter 6 hours earlier, and the man on the ground was one of theirs. She looked at the wound and died again. She looked at the gun, still holstered at the nearest operator's hip, blood spreading across the concrete in a dark, unhurried pool. She knelt down. The last patient Nadia Ose treated at Clearwater Regional Hospital was a 71-year-old retired postal worker named Mr. Baines, who had come in with a laceration on his forearm from a rose bush in his garden. He was embarrassed about it. Kept apologizing for wasting her time. Manel the teen. She told him nobody's time was wasted on a Tuesday, and he laughed at that in the uncertain way of someone who wasn't sure if they'd been given permission to laugh. Immune Rifles spoke. She dressed the wound with more care than the situation technically required, checked twice that the bandage was right, told him to watch for redness at the edges. He shook her hand when he left, in a handshake, both of his wrapped around hers. That was at 11:22 p.m. and 50. C. Green Green. Nadia was standing in the corridor outside the nursing director's office, with her hospital ID in her hand, and the particular flatness in her chest that came from not being surprised by something that should have surprised her. Nolger spoke. Nurse manager Colette Wren was inside with the door half open, which meant she either hadn't noticed Nadia arrive or she had, and didn't care enough to close it. Either option told her something. Mordnade. The HR coordinator, a woman named Steph, whose last name Nadia had never learned, because Steph had made it clear in every interaction that she preferred it that way, a folder across the small table in the anteroom without making eye contact. Final pay, processed by Friday. Benefits continue through end of month, and your access lanyard before you leave the building. Nadia set the lanyard on the table. Not a dramatic gesture. She didn't throw it. About throwing it during the last half of her shift, when the thing was already decided, and she was finishing out of professional habit and nothing else. But when the moment arrived, she just set it down quietly. And that quietness felt truer than anything else she could have done. Sheer. Is there anything else? She asked. Steph looked at the folder instead of at her. No, I think that covers it. Nadia walked out. Spoke. The emergency exit from the medical wing opened into a covered staff lot that smelled of exhaust and Lake Ontario cold. October in Portsmouth came off the water with an edge to it that you never quite got used to. The sky was low and orange-gray from the city's light pollution bouncing off the cloud cover. Her car was in row 3. She'd parked it in the same spot for 6 years, out of a habit she'd never bothered to examine. She was almost at it when she saw them. Girls blocking the exit lane. Dark, no plates visible, engines off. But the condensation still rising from the exhaust ports, thin in the cold air. Recent. Very recent. Nadia had spent 3 years working in field medical roles that she didn't advertise on her resume and didn't explain at job interviews. Those 3 years had left her with certain habits that civilian hospital life had softened but not erased. The positioning of the vehicles the way she'd been trained to read things. Not random. Not confused GPS. Deliberate. 2 lanes blocked, not one. The geometry of someone who needed to control departures. She took 1 step back toward the hospital entrance. A figure stepped out from beside the rear vehicle, then 2 more from the far side, and then a 4th. Coming around the nose of the first SUV with the measured pace of someone who was not rushing, because rushing would imply she had an option worth rushing toward. They wore civilian clothes. Jackets. Dark jackets. Nothing that announced anything. But she knew the way they moved, the spacing between them, the fact that not one of them broke eye contact with her, or looked at the ground or at each other. Ming spoke. She'd worked alongside people who moved like that. The one in front was maybe 45. That looked like it had been broken once and reset by someone in a hurry. Eyes that were brown and unhurried and gave back exactly nothing. Nadia Osei, he said. Not a question. Who's asking? We need a nurse. Right now, we don't have time for a longer explanation than that. She looked at the four of them. She looked at the vehicles. She looked at the distance between her and the hospital entrance, and between her and it now. You could have called, she said. We did, without apology. You weren't available yet. His name, she would learn later, was Sergeant Tolliver. He didn't offer it then. Commander. He just stepped aside and gestured toward the closer vehicle with the economy of someone who had arranged a situation and expected the situation to be accepted. Not Nadia's pulse was even. Minded, she noticed that as a clinical fact. Her body remembered things her conscious mind had worked 6 years to put down. Nadia's memory with a kind of distant professional respect. Someone's hurt, she said. Yes. How bad? Tolliver looked at her for a half-beat. Might. Bad enough that we're standing in a hospital parking lot at midnight. She got in. She didn't ask where they were going. She asked what she was dealing with. The operator in the rear seat beside her was younger, dark-haired, with a field dressing at his right shoulder that someone had applied without the benefit of training. He said. High, arterial. Something cold and organized moved through her thinking. Subclavian injuries were killers. Artery sat in a location that made compression unpredictable and surgical access difficult even in a properly equipped OR. Without direct intervention, the volume dropped fast, and it dropped in ways that didn't always look as dramatic as they were until there was very little time left. How long ago? 35 minutes. Pressure on it? Manual. In it. What's in the kit? A pause. Field trauma. Tourniquets. Hemostatic gauze. Saline. 2 large bore IVs. Running. Yes. Blood type? Another pause. A negative. Do you have blood on site? No. Nadia looked out the window. They were moving south through the industrial waterfront, past the old mill district. Venger spoke. Past the grain elevators that had been there since before anyone currently alive could remember. The streets were empty and wet. The lake was somewhere to the right, invisible, behind the warehouses and the October dark. She ran the numbers the way she'd been trained to run them. 35 minutes. Arterial. Manual compression. Product. Still. He was in the window still, but the window had a shape and it was narrowing. When we get there, she said, I make every call. Nobody argues with me. Nobody touches him unless I ask. Me. What I can and can't do. Is that understood? The man in the front passenger seat, the one who hadn't spoken yet, turned just enough that she caught his profile. Understood, he said. His voice had the flat quality of someone who kept their register low as a matter of long practice. And I need light, real light. Everything you have, the facility was a cold storage building in Portsmouth's Lower Harbor District, Moon. The kind that had been repurposed 3 times since it stopped being used for its original function, and now mostly served as an address on paper for logistics companies, whose actual operations happened somewhere else. The interior was high-ceilinged and cold. Tactical lights on portable stands threw white beams across a concrete floor that still smelled faintly of industrial refrigerant. There was a man on the floor. He was large, over 6 feet, built like someone who had spent a long time being required to carry things. His skin had the gray-white quality of significant blood loss. Another operator was kneeling beside him, with both hands pressed hard against the upper chest and shoulder junction. The dressings had soaked through. He had pulled in a dark ellipse beneath them, on the concrete. His breathing was short and rapid. His eyes were open. They were moving. Nadia crossed the space at a walk. Running spent energy and signaled panic to the patient and to everyone watching. She dropped to her knees on the cold floor. What's his name, Jared? said the man holding pressure, commenting a tootster spoke. His voice was scraped clean of everything, except the held-down terror of someone who had been watching a teammate die in increments for the past 35 minutes, not Jared. In 2 fingers to the side of his jaw and turned his face toward her. His eyes found her face. Not focused, but tracking. I'm a nurse. I'm going to help you. Can you hear me? His lips moved without making sound. That was enough. She looked at the man holding pressure. On my count, you shift your hands exactly where I put mine. Not before, not after. Really on my count. If you move early, we lose him. Do you understand? He nodded. His hands were shaking. What's your name, Garrett? Garrett, look at me. She waited. I needed him, looking at her before she said the next thing. You have kept him alive for 35 minutes. That's the hardest part already done. Now let me finish it. She opened the trauma kit with one hand and assessed the injury with the other. The hemostatic gauze was there. The field tourniquet, none spoke, which was of limited use at the subclavian, but could contribute to a modified compression structure if she built it correctly. Someone had packed this kit with thought. They hadn't anticipated this specific injury location, but they'd packed it with thought. She had an idea. It wasn't clean, but it would work. I need something rigid, she said. A board, a flat case, anything with surface area. And I need the longest strip of fabric available right now. Someone moved behind her. 30 seconds later, a hard-sided equipment case was beside her left knee, and a jacket was pressed into her hand. She worked, obeyed, Tisnaldavir did. What she did in the next 9 minutes was not something she would have described to anyone who hadn't been there. Not because it was beyond description, but because description reduced it to steps. And it wasn't steps. It was one continuous thing. Hemostatic gauze, packed with direct manual force. Garrett's hands shifted on her count. The jacket folded into a bolster, and the case positioned to create downward leverage. Direct is directed to maintain compression in rotation, because individual fatigue would drop the pressure. Harder, no. Toward the collarbone. Not your full weight, controlled weight. Hold. Men, tell me, his color. Better. Someone said it quietly, his color's better. She didn't stop to assess that. He knew. 9 minutes after she'd knelt down, she sat back on her heels for exactly 1 breath and looked at Jared's face. More color. Breathing still fast, but it had deepened. Her eyes were tracking with intention. He's stable, she said. Stable doesn't mean safe. He needs a vascular surgeon in the next hour. Wherever you're taking him, call now. She looked at Tolliver across the space. Right now. He was already on a radio. Amade with hers only then, with her hands. Still. And the emergency shifted into a different register. That Nadia became aware of the warehouse slice. In a way she hadn't been when she was working. And a soldier spoke. When she was working, she saw what was in front of her and nothing else. That was the training. That was also just who she was. She looked at the space properly. Along the far wall there were stacked pallets, not haphazard, not the natural accumulation of an old storage facility, organized, labeled, of the kind of systematic stacking that meant multiple people over time following a consistent process. She couldn't read the labels from 15 meters away in the direction the tactical lights weren't pointing, but she recognized the dimensions of what was stacked there. She'd ordered items in packaging that size. She'd inventoried shortages of items in packaging that size. For the past 8 months, she'd been filing reports about items in packaging, that exact size disappearing from Clearwater Regional's supply records in ways that her supervisors kept attributing to a legacy data migration issue that had never quite been fully resolved. She looked at the pallets for 4 seconds. That 4 seconds was enough. Tolliver's radio crackled. Ramon spoke. He moved toward the bay doors on the far side of the warehouse, where pale ambient light from the dock outside was beginning to gray in the pre-dawn. She heard him speaking low and quickly. She caught fragments. The phrase "package is secured." She caught something else that stripped the residual warmth from the air around her. 4 words. She doesn't know yet. Nadia looked at her blood-covered hands. Pallets. She looked at the pallets. She looked at Tolliver's back. Seated. She had spent 8 months filing inventory discrepancy reports at Clearwater Regional. She had done it with increasing specificity and increasing frustration. The missing items mapped across 6 departments. The missing items mapped across a procurement timeline. She had eventually reconstructed on her own time from publicly accessible hospital supply contracts. The missing items had a pattern, and the pattern had a shape. And the shape was not a legacy data migration issue. 4 times by nurse manager Wren. That she was creating administrative noise. She'd been told twice by the supply chain coordinator that her reports were being reviewed. She'd been told once by the hospital's COO, Dr. Ellery Vance, in a 20-minute meeting that had felt like a door being politely but firmly closed. Terminal appreciated her diligence and that the matter was in hand. The matter had not been in hand, and spoke. If she didn't know something, there was something to know. Jared made a sound, pain, and awareness coming back through the pain, and she turned back to him because that was what she did in any situation, regardless of what else was happening. She managed the immediate emergency in front of her, but the other part of her thinking was already moving through 8 months of anomalies and closed-door meetings and stacked pallets in a cold storage building, reassembling something whose shape she hadn't understood she'd been standing inside. The bay doors opened wide. Outside, the sound of a helicopter, not emergency services. The rhythm was too measured, too controlled, military, or close enough to military to count. Tolliver walked back across the warehouse floor. His face had changed. Something in it that she hadn't been there when he'd spoken to her in the parking lot. Not command, not assessment. Something that was adjacent to reckoning. There are things you need to understand, he said. And you are, Nadia said. He considered that. Not hostile, just measuring the weight of it. Special Operations Support Unit, he said, attached to CJOC. We don't have a public profile. We need Joint Operations Command. She knew the name, She knew what the name meant in terms of what kinds of operations it covered and what kinds of oversight it didn't. And the pallets, she said. Tolliver's jaw shifted. How long have they been here? At her, for a beat that ran 1 second too long. How would you know what those are? Because I spent 8 months filing shortage reports at Clearwater Regional. Nadia said, and I know what a hospital-grade biombid supply pallet looks like at 15 meters in low light. Enough of them. She kept her voice level. How long? He exhaled through his nose. Minimum 16 months, possibly longer. We're still building the full chain. 16 months. Spare? Man. She had been at Clearwater Regional for 8. This had been running before she'd walked through the doors, underneath everything, and she had stumbled into the edge of it, without understanding what she was stumbling into. Who's running it? She said. That's the conversation we need to have. He paused. Can you walk? She looked at her hands. Still dark to the wrist. Do I have a choice? You always have a choice, he said. We're not the ones who took yours away. That landed differently than he probably intended. She followed him. The room behind the unmarked door was small and functional. Folding table, 4 chairs, a laptop on a satellite uplink. A woman was sitting at the table. Late 30s, close-cropped hair, yes, the same deliberately unremarkable civilian clothes as everyone else. Her expression wasn't the operational blankness of the others. There was something in it, not warmth exactly. Recognition. This is Agent Fiona Mercer, Tolliver said. MP Federal Serious and Organized Crime. Mercer nodded. Sit down, Nadia. I'd rather stand. That's fine. Mercer turned the laptop to face the room. What I'm about to show you is not formally declassified. We're outside the standard chain of custody tonight for reasons that will become apparent. The sensitivity level is equivalent to classified regardless. That means you'd rather I didn't discuss it in public. Mercer glanced at Tolliver. More or less, she said, and opened the first document. It was a procurement manifest. Nadia recognized the format. She'd processed hundreds of similar documents in her first year at Clearwater Regional. Nader spoke, back when she still believed that hospital procurement could be made orderly if you applied enough attention to it. The header was standard. Items listed were standard. Surgical consumables, IV materials, hemostatic agents, wound care products. The quantities were large but not implausible for a hospital of Clearwater's size. The destination facility codes were wrong. She leaned forward before she'd made a decision to lean forward. These aren't hospital identifiers, she said. No, Mercer said. What are they? Shell entities, numbered corporations registered in Alberta and Brunswick over a 14-month window beginning 3 years ago. On paper, they function as regional medical distribution companies. In practice, they receive the shipment, reclassify it internally, and pass it on. Pass it on to where? To buyers, Tolliver said from behind her. Off-book. Buyers who don't ask questions about provenance. Nadia straightened. A minute, Tatsine. You're telling me someone has been selling Canadian military medical inventory on a secondary market. Some of it military, some civilian hospital supply diverted before it reaches the ward level. The operation runs across both systems. Mercer pulled up the next document. The civilian component is where Clearwater comes in. The next document was a procurement contract, and a soldier spoke. Nadia's eyes went to the signatory at the bottom, and then to the issuing institution at the top, and something in her chest did something specific and unpleasant. Clearwater Regional, remaining with a supply agreement with one of the shell entities, dated 14 months ago. 4 months before she'd been hired. They were already running this when I started, she said. Yes, and the discrepancies I was documenting were real, Mercer said. Every one of them. You were pulling records of inventory that had already been diverted at origin. Your reports were being intercepted at the supervisory level and closed without escalation. Wren? Nadia said. A name arrived in her thinking without drama. Just the flat click of a piece finding its place. Nurse manager Colette Wren, who had closed 4 of Nadia's first 6 reports as duplicate entries. A nurse spoke, who had told her the data migration issue was being reviewed by IT. Wade, who had recommended in Nadia's last performance review that she redirect her energy from administrative concerns to direct patient care, which had been phrased as supportive, and had felt, correctly, a warning. Mercer didn't answer directly. That silence was its own answer. You need to understand the full scope of what you were operating inside, Tolliver said. Because you weren't terminated for poor performance. You were terminated because you were doing your job too well and too accurately, and the people who were being paid to suppress that accuracy had run out of quieter options. Nadia stood with that for a moment. The room was very still. Outside the bay doors, the helicopter rotor had slowed to idle. She'd known something was wrong. She'd known it the way you knew things you couldn't fully articulate. From the accumulation of small evidence, that rational explanation kept trying to absorb and couldn't quite. But there was a distance between knowing something wrong was happening and understanding the specific shape of the wrongness. And the shape of this one was considerably larger than she'd built it in her own thinking. Who's at the top of it, she said. Mercer opened a photograph. The man in it was in his 60s, medisalade. Silver hair, the posture of someone who had spent decades in uniform. The kind of face that appeared on appointment announcements and parliamentary committee briefings. 7. The kind of face that had been institutional for so long it had stopped looking like a person and started looking like a function. Brigadier General Harold Kessler, Menitide. Mercer said his name with the flatness of someone who had said it many times in rooms where it mattered. Director of Military Medical Logistics for the past 4 years. He controls procurement contracts for operational medical supplies across 3 CJOC commands, and has oversight authority under the Defense Health Services Integration Act for joint civilian-military hospital partnerships. Which means he decides where things go, Nadia said. Which means he decides where things go, Mercer confirmed. Maffer spoke. And for the past 3 years, a significant proportion of what was supposed to go to deployed operational medical teams went elsewhere instead. Grimminger spoke. The estimated total value of diverted inventory is between $50 and $75 million. The number was large enough to sit in the air for a moment, without immediately making sense. Nadia's thinking translated it the way it always translated abstraction. Units of hemostatic gauze. Units of blood product. All kits not on the shelf when someone needed them. People bleeding in places where the supply cabinet was lighter than it should have been because of decisions made at a desk by a man with 4 years and 2 stars. She felt something move through her that was older and quieter than anger. "What do you need from me?" she said. What they needed took 40 minutes to explain, and Nadia sat down eventually because standing started to feel like a performance. And this situation didn't have room for performances. Operation had been a covert evidence, gathering effort, targeting a physical inventory transfer point, this facility. Belanger spoke, used as a transfer node between the military side of the operation and the civilian distribution channel. The operation had been compromised. One operator was dead. Jared was alive because of Nadia, but his injury meant their primary evidence relay was broken. Documentation. He'd been carrying physical documentation recovered from the previous transfer site before the operation had gone active. That documentation was now partially unrecoverable. What they had was a fragmented record that pointed clearly at Kessler but didn't close the civilian hospital connection. Without the civilian connection, a man spoke. A defense team with Kessler's resources had room to work. The civilian connection runs through Clearwater's procurement records, Mercer said. Specifically, not purchase orders generated over an 18-month window that were authorized at the administrative director level. Dr. Ellery Vance, Nadia said. Mercer looked at her. The COO, Versi spoke. He signed off on everything in the supply chain partnership category, or his signature was on everything, at minimum. I had a meeting with him 8 months ago about the discrepancy pattern. He was very reasonable. He told me the hospital took supply integrity seriously, and that my reports were being reviewed at the appropriate level. He was careful, Mercer said. He stayed at administrative distance from anything directly traceable. She knows, Tolliver said from behind Nadia. That's why we need the documentation. Your reports, Mercer said. Anomalier spoke. The 8 months of discrepancy filings create a contemporaneous record of inventory anomalies that map directly onto the diversion timeline. With rifles spoke. If we can access the original filed versions with their timestamps and routing metadata, we can establish that hospital administration received documented evidence of irregular activity and suppressed it. Administrative failure. That's conspiracy. Those reports are in Clearwater's internal quality management system, Nadia said, which I no longer have access to as of approximately 2 hours ago. The woman of the soldier spoke. We have someone who can reach this externally. Mercer folded her hands on the table. Women, we need you to guide them through what to look for. Report categories, filing pathways, specific item codes. The technical access isn't the problem. The institutional knowledge is. About the 8 months of reports. She had been precise, because vague complaints went nowhere, and she had known that early. She had cited specific procurement codes, specific receiving timestamps, specific variance amounts. She had written them like legal documents because she had wanted them to matter and known how much they were going to matter. All right, she said. Tell me what you need. There's something else, Tolliver said. Something in his tone made Mercer look at him, made Nadia look at him. Jared was carrying a secondary item from the previous site. He reached into his jacket and placed a small waterproof evidence bag on the table. Inside was a drive. Military spec, ruggedized casing. We recovered it before the medevac. The casing was cracked at one corner. Inside looked intact. We can't confirm the contents, Tolliver said. The encryption is multi-factor. We have part of the key, but we're missing a component. You think the component is in my reports. We think the component is in something you wrote, Mercer said. A specific anomaly notation you filed 6 months ago that referenced an unrecognized procurement code, slammed gear. We believe that code is a fragment of the encryption scheme, and we believe it was missed by Kessler's people because you embedded it in technical supply language that read as standard error, flagging. Know what it was, Nadia said. We know, Mercer said. That's what makes it better evidence, not worse. The room had a different weight than it had had 15 minutes ago. In its evidence bag. She looked at her hands, still dark, dried now, at the edges. Almost sun. She was in a cold storage facility in the lower harbor at 3 in the morning with a government agent and a special operations sergeant and a drive that might contain 3 years of a criminal network's operational records. And the reason she was here was that she had spent 8 months filing accurate reports about supply cabinet shortages. It wasn't the life she had planned. She couldn't have planned it. And said, there was no version of her 7 years ago arriving for her first hospital shift that could have mapped to this room. What do we do first? She said. They worked through the rest of the night. Bayer spoke. Someone brought her a bottle of water and a clean cloth, and she did what she could with her hands, which wasn't much. She drank the water fast. She sat in front of the laptop and started talking. The voice on the secure connection identified himself only as Turner. Bill spoke. He walked her through Clearwater Regional's quality management system remotely, while she described it from memory. She knew its specific logic, its counterintuitive category structure, and supply discrepancy. Reports had been routed under a clinical safety subfolder rather than a procurement subfolder, because someone had designed the system without consulting the people who'd use it. Main variance flags go under clinical operations, Nadia said, not supply chain. Then subfolder 2, which is called inventory quality. And within that, there's a secondary sort by severity rating. My reports were all filed as moderate because significant triggered an automatic executive review, which kept getting redirected. I'm in the clinical operations directory, Turner said. Inventory quality now. Going in, a pause. I'm seeing flagged reports. There are another pause, slightly longer, 42 reports in this subfolder attributed to your staff ID. Julia said, I filed 49. The silence that followed had weight. 7 reports are absent from the active record, Turner said. Looking at the date gaps now. The missing filings would fall in February, March, and 2 in June, and 3 in September. February and March had been when she'd shifted from general observations to systematic documentation with specific item codes and quantity variances cited by date. And a mentor spoke. June had been when she'd flagged the unrecognized procurement code in the incoming supply manifest and hadn't understood what it was or why it didn't match any supplier identifier in the hospital's vendor database. Denied. September had been when Dr. Vance had called her in for the 20-minute meeting, and she had left it with the clear understanding that she was being asked, politely, to stop. The ones that would build the clearest case, she said. 7 of them, Turner confirmed. And here's the thing. His voice shifted. Deleted records aren't gone. They're metadata orphaned. I'm running a recovery pass on the database index now. Another pause. They're here. All 7. Admin. Someone deleted them from the active directory, but didn't wipe the underlying data. Either they were in a hurry or they didn't understand how the system's architecture actually works at the back-end level for them, already running it. 8 minutes in metadata was closer to 11, but Turner delivered all 7 reports intact, with timestamps, with routing metadata showing exactly who had received the automated notification on filing, and critically, Jin spoke, with read confirmations on 2 of the reports indicating that someone at the executive access level had opened them within 72 hours of their submission. Dr. Vance had read them, get account. His personal administrator credentials, his session identifier, his timestamp. He had opened the reports that Nadia had written about the supply discrepancies. He had opened them, and then he had closed them. And then, with increasing velocity over the following weeks, he had begun the process of building a performance record against the nurse who had written them. Nadia looked at that red timestamp for a long time. What she felt wasn't satisfaction. It was something more complicated and slower. A kind of grief, maybe, for the version of the past 8 months she'd been carrying where she had simply been wrong, simply not good enough, simply unlucky in her supervisors and the institutional culture and the timing of things. That version had been easier to carry than this one. This version meant she'd been right. Muse spoke. It meant 8 months of professional erosion had been deliberate. It meant the people who'd told her she was creating noise had known she was creating signal. She'd been right. It meant to tend, and being right had been exactly what they'd used against her. Upload everything, Mercer said. All 7 recovered, and the 42 it's intact. Already going, Turner said. The drive's decryption took longer. Manifest. The procurement code she'd flagged in June, a 16-character alphanumeric string that had appeared on an incoming supply manifest, with no corresponding vendor registration in the hospital's database, in the encryption key second authentication layer. Give them the full key, but it gave Turner's analysis enough scaffolding to run a targeted reconstruction. At 4:17 a.m., the drive opened. What came out of it was operational data. Deliberate record-keeping, not a ledger somebody had maintained as a confession. It was the living infrastructure of the operation, kept because the operation required it to function. Guide. Supply chain logs, Chasino financial transfers, procurement authorizations, personnel communications. 3 years of it. The kind of data that couldn't be selectively revised because too many separate systems had produced too many interdependent records. And Turner worked through it while Nadia sat against the wall with her second bottle of water and watched the high window change. Black to deep blue. Deep blue beginning, at its edges, going to separate into the gray that preceded actual morning light. 11 names, Mercer said at some point. The lay soldier spoke. 11 individuals with operational roles confirmed in the transaction record. Kessler signs 4 of the primary procurement authorizations directly, Turner said. Drawn. The rest are routed through the civilian contractors, but the authorization chain traces back to his command clearance on each one. Mercer sat back. This is the whole picture. And enough for prosecution? I asked. Enough to begin fires in 3 separate jurisdictions. Simultaneously, Tolliver said. He was already on his phone. It had departed with Jared and 2 of the operators somewhere around 2 a.m. The warehouse felt smaller without them. Nadia was tired, in a way that went past the physical register, an exhausted quality that followed sustained adrenaline. Once the body understood, it was allowed to stop. She thought about her car still in the hospital parking lot. That thought, mundane against everything else, almost made her laugh. Tolliver came back. His face had the look of a dial that had moved. What? Mercer said. Kessler knows the operation was compromised tonight. Tolliver's voice was level, but only just. And he's initiated a document security protocol at CFB Ottawa, and he's been in contact with Clearwater administration. Vance, specifically. Contact made approximately 25 minutes ago. Amen. Nadia was standing before she'd decided to stand. He's telling Vance to clean the physical records, she said. Migrated. Whatever hasn't been migrated to the digital system. Paper supply logs, original procurement sign-offs, anything that can be removed from the premises without leaving a digital trace. Omission. We don't know the specific content of the communication. I know what a cover your tracks call sounds like, she said. How much time do we have? Vance's building access was logged at 3:51 a.m., Turner said through the connection. He's already inside. Nadia looked at Mercer. Tell me, you can get a warrant in the next 20 minutes. Mercer's expression was controlled. Federal warrant process for a civilian hospital with active patients is between 2 and 4 hours minimum. So, the physical records are going to be gone before you can get anyone inside legally, Nadia said. Mercer looked at her in a way that wasn't quite agreement, and wasn't quite anything else either. There is one way into that building right now that doesn't require a warrant. Mercer said it slowly, as if testing the weight of each word. Nadia waited. Your access. Lanyard was deactivated at midnight, and your physical ID card was processed by the hospital's security intake when you signed out tonight. Under Clearwater Regional's own administrative protocol, a terminated employee's physical identification is retained for 72 hours in the security office in the event of an administrative appeal of the termination. I know the protocol. Amenity. The overnight security officer has the discretion to permit a former employee access for the purpose of collecting personal property. The overnight authorization window is self-documented. Munson spoke. And HR doesn't respond to overnight inquiries for a minimum of 60 to 90 minutes. Nadia understood the implication without it being stated. She thought about 8 months of careful, spoke, precise work that had been received as a problem to be managed and used as material to build a case against her. On the cold floor. She thought about Jared on the cold floor. She thought about the name for the operator who hadn't made it out, which she didn't know yet, but whose absence had a specific weight in the room that she'd been aware of since Tolliver had told her without telling her at the beginning of all this. She thought about the June report. The procurement code she'd flagged because flagging anomalies was what you did, because that was the job. Netcher spoke, because she'd known since her first week in a field medical unit that the difference between a supply cabinet that was right and a supply cabinet that was short was the difference between someone living and someone not living. Here's my lanyard, she said. Tolliver reached into his jacket and set it on the table. Her name on the card, her photograph. The Clearwater Regional emblem. She'd carried it for 6 years. She'd clipped it to the same loop on the same bag every single morning. She picked it up. I need to know the layout of the administrative wing and Vance's specific office location. I can give you all of that, Turner said through the connection. One more thing, Tolliver said. He was looking at her with that measured look again, the one that was still working through something. Montai. You understand that if Vance makes contact with anyone in Kessler's network before we have a warrant in place, the situation inside that building becomes... I know, Nadia said. I've made difficult calls before. He nodded. Something in it that contained both acknowledgement and something else she couldn't quite name. She was almost at the door when Mercer's voice stopped her. OC, she turned. Noon. The report you filed in June, the one with the procurement code, your manager spoke. You escalated it through every available channel, even after 3 prior reports went nowhere. Yes, why? You could have stopped. Most people would have stopped by that point. About the honest answer. It wasn't heroic. She'd been tired by June. She'd been tired since March. A soldier spoke. Tired of the closed reports and the redirections and the feeling of finishing something accurate into a system that was designed to receive it and then forget it. But she'd also worked in places where a short supply cabinet wasn't an administrative inconvenience. She'd worked in places where a missing trauma kit meant someone bled into the floor, Tabuscu, and she couldn't make herself right off the gap between what should have been there and what wasn't as a database problem when she knew what database problems looked like. And this wasn't one, said. Because something was wrong, she said, and I knew how to document it. She walked out, and outside was dense and cold. The lake was somewhere behind the warehouses, patient and enormous, invisible. She could smell it. It had grown up inland, and had never quite lost the slight surprise. She felt at the scale of Lake Ontario in the dark, at the way it made the air different. She had a lanyard in her hand. Linder spoke. She had 30 minutes before the sky changed. The SUV started. Tolliver was driving. Neither of them spoke. The city moved past the windows in its night shape. Mindy. Street lights and empty roads, and the occasional lit window of someone else awake at this hour. She held the lanyard in her hands and looked at her own photograph, which was 2 years old, and showed a version of herself that had not yet filed any of the 49 reports. She looked younger in it, not physically. In the eyes, Clearwater Regional came into view with its upper floors, lit against the gray beginning sky. The emergency entrance amber-lit at the base. Pulled to the service road beside the staff entrance. Turner's, on your earpiece, he said. He handed her a small device. She put it in. Vance is in the administrative wing, 2nd floor east. He's been stationary in his office for 8 minutes. Turner's voice was immediate and calm. Overnight security is a Constable Nguyen. He's worked the shift for 2 years. He's seen you before. All right, one more thing, Turner said. His voice shifted slightly. Then a soldier spoke. There are 2 additional individuals in the building that aren't on the overnight roster. They badged in through the loading entrance 4 minutes after Vance. Credentials they used are flagged as inactive in the system. Nadia's hand stilled on the door handle. Who? Working on it. But they came in behind Vance, using credentials that shouldn't work. At access. She looked at Tolliver. He looked back. He'd heard through the earpiece. Someone helped him in, he said quietly. In your system. Someone who knew the system. She thought about that for exactly as long as she could afford to think about it, which was 3 seconds. Then she got out of the car, armed a vis. The staff entrance had a keypad and a card reader, and she had used both approximately 5,000 times over 6 years, and her hands moved to them before she'd made a conscious decision. ID touched the reader. The reader beeped once. The light stayed red. She'd known it would. She pressed the intercom. Inner security, overnight. Constable Nguyen. It's Nadia Osei. I was on staff until last night. I left some personal items in my locker and I need to pick them up. A pause. A tired pause of someone recalculating their evening. Ms. Osei. You know I have to call this in. HR won't pick up for at least another hour, but I know the protocol. I just need my things. 10 minutes. Another pause. Come around to the main lobby entrance. I'll buzz you through. She walked around. Turner's voice came through the earpiece. Low. Turner's tracking the 2 unknown badges. They're on the 2nd floor now, moving toward the administrative east wing. Toward Vance. The main lobby doors clicked, and she pushed through them. Win was at the security desk, with a coffee that had gone cold and the expression of a man whose night had just become slightly more complicated than he'd planned. Thank you for this, Nadia said, and she meant it, which made the next question harder. I still have to log it, he said. Former employee after hours, access, even for personal property. I know. She stopped at the desk. Nguyen. Is there anyone else in the building tonight that you weren't expecting? He looked at her. She said, I'm not asking you to violate anything. I'm asking if you personally saw someone come through that you didn't recognize. The pause this time had a different quality. A soldier spoke. His eyes moved briefly toward the stairwell door. Mr. Vance came in just before 4. He said it carefully. He sometimes comes in early when there's a board matter. And there were two others through the loading entrance. He paused. I didn't recognize them. She held his gaze. Nguyen, acknowledgers soak. If something is happening in this building right now that shouldn't be, if someone in there is doing something under time pressure, you don't want to be standing between them and the exit when this resolves. A person who called Portsmouth Regional Police now. Not administration. The police. He looked at her for 4 seconds. Then he picked up his radio. She went for the stairs. The common floor administrative wing was on overnight lighting. Every third panel, spoke, which gave the corridor the institutional dimness she knew from the 2 times she'd been up here to follow up on reports that had gone nowhere. She knew this hallway. She knew which fluorescent panel flickered. In our nation, she knew the specific squeak of the third door from the stairwell exit. Vance is still in his office, Turner said, in her ear. Third door from the east stairwell. Light under the door. All unidentified individuals are on your floor. I don't have camera coverage in the east wing, only the lobby and the stairwells. She kept walking. Her footsteps were deliberate, quiet, but not stealthy. It would look wrong. Stealthy would look wrong, and looking wrong was a liability she couldn't afford. And then a soldier spoke. She saw the light under the third door. She also saw 40 feet further down the corridor where the east wing opened onto the administrative suite anteroom. 2 shapes in the dim that weren't furniture. Now it's standing still. One of them turned its head just slightly, and the overnight lighting caught a face for half a second. Male. 40s. The kind of stillness that was trained rather than natural, and not hospital staff. Nadia turned, unhurried, and knocked on Vance's door. Dr. Vance, it's Nadia Osei. The silence lasted long enough to be a decision being made. Come in. Morning's a morning. Dr. Ellery Vance looked better in the photographs that appeared in the hospital's annual report than he did at 4:30 in the morning, with his desk covered in papers being moved at speed and the high color in his face of someone whose blood pressure was doing something he wished it wasn't. Her, and his face spoke. And his face did something it managed to suppress before it became entirely readable. The edge of it, not just surprise. Calculation. The specific calculation of a man trying to determine what she knew and what she could prove. Miss Osei. His voice was practiced. This is very irregular. I came for my things. I couldn't sleep. She looked at his desk. Made it obvious she was looking. Your locker is in the staff wing, he said. Not administrative. I know. I thought I'd stop by first. She held his gaze. Argumented. Since we didn't have a chance to speak yesterday when HR processed my termination, there was nothing to discuss. The decision was properly documented. Thoroughly documented, she said. Committed. I've been thinking about some of my reports, the inventory variance filings. I went back to look at the record last night. Some gaps. 7 reports that should be in the active file aren't. And his face shifted. System data retention has occasional anomalies, he said. An IT question. You read 2 of them personally, she said. It flat. I have the session log with your credentials and your timestamp. The room went still. Turner's voice in her ear, barely a murmur. Individuals are moving. They're coming toward you. Nadia kept her eyes on Vance. Did you read my reports? Dr. Vance? He stood up from behind his desk, not aggressively. Repositioning. Creating options. Ms. spoke. I'm going to need you to leave this building, Ms. Osei. Concerns about your records. That's a matter for the appeal process. I called the police on my way up, she said. The overnight security officer has already made contact. It was half true. Nguyen had been making a call when she'd gone to the stairwell. Whether he'd reached anyone was unknown. Vance's face changed. Shed something. The professional distance, imitator, the reasonable administrator managing an unreasonable situation. What was underneath it wasn't rage. It was the stripped-down arithmetic of someone who had run out of quieter options. You have made a significant mistake tonight, he said. Multiple, probably, Nadia said. Not about this? The door opened. The two men who came through it were not hospital security. She'd known that from the corridor. Confirmed it now. The older one was the face she'd seen in the anteroom. The younger one had a military haircut and eyes that said he hadn't been military for a while, which was a specific and different thing from never having been. We need to move, the older one said to Vance. The window is. She called the police, Vance said. A beat. The older one's eyes went to Nadia. She was calculating the distance to the door, which these two were now between her and the distance to Vance. The papers on the desk, phone, the earpiece in her ear, connecting her to someone who could hear everything in this room if she kept talking. Turner, she said, in a normal voice, someone present. Are you getting all of this? The older one moved fast. Not at her, past her, toward the desk phone. And he pulled the cord from the wall in one clean motion. And he stopped and looked at her ear. Who are you talking to? Someone who's listening, she said. He was quick. And a soldier spoke. Her read on his professionalism was confirmed. Commander spoke. His right hand went to his jacket and came out with something compact and matte, and that answered the question she'd been filing away since she'd seen them in the corridor. Tolliver, she said. Second floor east. Now would be a good time. No response in her ear. Vance was gathering papers into a folder with the focused speed of a man who had made a decision and was now simply executing it. Get her out of the building, man, he said to the older man. Separately, clean. That means different things to different people, Nadia said. It means we take you somewhere quiet and have a conversation about your options, the older man said. His voice was reasonable, and was what was frightening about it. The complete reasonableness of it. You came to the wrong building for a quiet conversation, she said. Turner's voice came back into her ear, fractured, an interference. Federal units inbound. Tolliver is in the lobby. 2 minutes, minutes. Both nothing and everything depending on what filled it. The younger man was at the window now. Something outside, a presence. Someone's outside, he said. One's attention fractured for half a second. The direction of his attention shifted. Nadia moved toward the desk. She put both hands flat on the papers Vance was gathering and pushed. Quickly, just a flat outward push. The papers went in 3 directions. The folder went with them. Not D-Dune. Vance grabbed for them and caught half. In the 3 seconds of that, she got her phone from her jacket and photographed the desk. Then again, then a soldier spoke. The paper that landed face up in front of her was a financial transfer record. She couldn't read all of it, but she caught the name of one of the shell entities from Mercer's documents. A dollar figure with 6 zeros. She caught a date 11 days ago. Third photograph. The older man had her arm. Professional grip, not rough. The kind designed to move a person without leaving marks that needed explanation later. Give me the phone. Tell me your name first. He looked briefly annoyed with himself for how long he paused. Danforth. Danforth. She repeated clearly for the earpiece, and Dr. Vance. And a financial transfer record dated 11 days ago connected to. He took the phone from her hand, clean, efficient, into his jacket. We're going, he said. Walk her toward the door, because the door was where she wanted to be. The corridor outside was the same institutional dimness. Danforth was close behind her. The younger one was ahead. Vance was still gathering papers. They reached the stairwell door. Danforth pushed it open and stopped. Up the stairs, moving with the ground-level certainty of people who held complete legal authority to go wherever in this building they chose, were 3 individuals in federal identification. Behind them, a Portsmouth Regional police officer, radio in hand, and behind him, Tolliver. Tolliver looked at Nadia, then at Danforth, then at the gun that Danforth had not reholstered. Put it down, Tolliver said, in the voice of someone who had given this instruction before and understood its exact grammar. The stairwell was quiet for a moment. Billy spoke. Then Danforth made the calculation that trained people made when the geometry had definitively shifted. He placed the weapon on the stair railing, grip first. Nadia exhaled. Not dramatically, releasing something it had been clenched around. Vance is in his office, she said. Third door. Papers on the desk and floor. Can anyone move them before the positions are documented? And there are financial transfer records. I photographed the desk before my phone was taken. She looked at Danforth's jacket pocket. One of the federal officers stepped forward. Mercer, Tolliver said, was already on a call. He nodded toward the officer. The phone came back to her. She checked. All 3 photographs intact. The cloud backup had already run 18 months ago. Because she kept losing photographs when her phone died. The most ordinary possible reason. The most useful possible result. She sat down on the stair and let her legs do what they'd been wanting to do for the last 6 minutes. The next 2 hours happened around her in the organized particular chaos of federal law enforcement. Arriving at a location. Vance was walked out of his office 25 minutes later without his folder, with 2 officers flanking him, and with the expression of a man whose planning had been built entirely around a version of this morning that no longer existed. He looked at Nadia as they passed her in the corridor. She looked back, saying. There was nothing that needed saying. Danforth and the younger one, whose name turned out to be Carriere, were processed in the lobby. Danforth was cooperative in the flat, careful way of someone already calculating what he was and wasn't willing to offer. Carriere was less composed. Mercer found Nadia in a small conference room, off the lobby, where someone had brought her coffee she hadn't asked for and was drinking because it was warm. Turner recovered everything before the connection dropped, Mercer said. All the financial documents on Vance's desk were photographed in situ by the forensic team. 3 photographs are in the evidence chain. And the drive. The drive is in federal custody. Decryption was confirmed complete at 4:09 a.m. Authorization is attached to 97 individual transactions over a 38-month period. Mercer sat down across from her. Jared is out of surgery at the military medical facility. Nahmer spoke. The vascular team said the stabilization work you performed was, she paused, choosing the reason he had a viable repair option when they opened him. Anna nodded. She didn't need the acknowledgement. She was glad he was alive. And Kessler filed for emergency leave authorization at 3:45 a.m. He's still on base, armed with a gun. Federal investigators are en route with an arrest warrant. He doesn't know yet that the drive was recovered or decrypted. He thinks tonight's operation failed. He has about 40 minutes then. Mercer looked at her. I want to ask you something. Ask. The June report. The procurement code you flagged. Menu. You'd had 3 reports suppressed by that point. You had every professional reason to stop filing. Why didn't you? Nadia looked at the bad coffee. I worked field medical rotations for 3 years before I came to Clearwater, she said. Deployed rotations. I spent those years in places where the gap between what was supposed to be on the shelf and what was actually on the shelf was the difference between someone bleeding to death and someone not bleeding to death. Specifically, I'd seen it happen. She looked at Mercer. So when I was seeing inventory anomalies at Clearwater, I couldn't make them abstract. I knew what a short trauma kit meant in practice. I kept filing because I knew what the gap cost, even without knowing why the gap existed. Mercer was quiet for a moment. You should have been brought into this 6 months ago. You're meant to know about me 6 months ago. We knew about the reports, Mercer said. We found them in the suppressed record. We didn't connect the name to the full picture until tonight. She met Nadia's eyes. We missed it. We had 14 active threads, and we missed the one person inside the institution who was documenting exactly what we needed. Nadia received that without making it larger than it was. People missed things. Problems had gaps. The specific gap had cost her a job, and 8 months she wasn't going to get back, and something that hadn't finished costing her yet. What happens now, she said. Mehmet. Kessler is arrested. Vance's cooperation determines the civilian prosecution timeline. Clearwater Regional enters administrative receivership, pending investigation. Mercer's voice was even. Jimena spoke. Your employment record will be reviewed as part of the conspiracy documentation. It matters. The performance case constructed against you appears to have been initiated in coordination with the supply chain suppression. Nadia had suspected something like that. Spook. Had suspected it, and then talked herself out of the suspicion, because the version where she had simply been unlucky was easier to live with than the version where the unluckiness was engineered. Injured. The world had been exactly that deliberately engineered. Mercer's phone rang. She stepped outside. Tolliver found Nadia 10 minutes later. He sat down across from her without ceremony. Engagement. Reeves submitted a formal recommendation this morning for your consulting engagement, he said. Independently. Nadia looked at him. CJOC's Medical Supply Integrity Unit. You'd be working within the Defense Accountability Framework, identifying supply chain anomalies in its records, building with evidence record staff who've observed irregularities without understanding what they're seeing. Like I was, Nadia said. Like you were, Tolliver said. Except now you'd know what you were looking at. She thought about it, thinking about it where she said yes, because the moment called for it. The actual version, where she sat with what it would require and what it would cost, and whether she was built for the sustained, unglamorous, soldier spoke. A grinding version of this work as opposed to the crisis version she'd been running on for the past 6 hours. She was 32 years old. She'd worked field rotations in conditions she didn't describe at job interviews. She'd spent 8 months filing accurate reports into a system designed to lose them. She'd stabilized a man with a subclavian laceration on a cold floor using a field kit and muscle memory. Emmett walked into a building at 4 a.m, knowing 2 unauthorized people were inside. And she'd done it because the alternative was watching 8 months of work disappear. She wasn't fearless. She'd been afraid for most of the past 6 hours, for a lot of the past 8 months, and portions of the 3 years before that. But fear had never been what stopped her. What had stopped her the few times it had was not knowing whether her work was reaching anyone, falling into a void and not knowing if the filing mattered. That part was over. Yes, she said. The formal charges against Harold Kessler were filed on a Wednesday. 94 counts. Federal fraud, conspiracy, and soldier spoke. Illegal diversion of government property, breach of military supply chain, integrity, obstruction. The announcement came from the Department of Justice in Ottawa and ran on every major national network by noon. Nadia watched it on her laptop in her apartment. A spokesperson read the charges with the flat precision of someone who had practiced the text until the text was just text. Behind her, on a screen, was a summary of the operation. Scale, timeline, pyramid, estimated value, 50 to 75 million in diverted military medical supplies over 38 months. Back, a network spanning military logistics and civilian hospital procurement. Nadia's name was not mentioned. That was deliberate, and she'd agreed to it. She wasn't interested in press conferences. What she was watching for was Kessler's face, which the cameras caught when he was walked into the federal courthouse in civilian clothes. He didn't look at the cameras. The lady, a point slightly left of them, the practiced non-gaze of someone managing a public moment. She closed the laptop. Doctor, a soldier spoke. Ellery Vance entered a cooperation agreement 11 days later, providing full financial documentation and communication records in exchange for reduced sentencing. And extended and corroborated everything in the recovered files. His attorney called it a difficult decision. The federal prosecutors called it comprehensive. Nurse manager Colette Wren was charged separately under a related conspiracy count. She had been receiving payments through a shell account for 14 months. The amounts were not large. That was its own particular fact about what someone had decided her cooperation was worth, and what she decided it was worth to her. Clearwater Regional entered administrative receivership. The board was dissolved. A court-appointed administrator took operational control, while the hospital's licensing status was reviewed and a public statement was issued confirming that patient care would continue uninterrupted. Process. Receivership was never clean. The clinical staff who had had nothing to do with the corruption spent months in the uncertainty of working for an institution whose future was being adjudicated in rooms they had no access to. Left. The ones who stayed did so under conditions more difficult than they deserved. That was a real cost paid by real people, and it was part of the account that Vance and Kessler and the others had run up without ever intending to settle themselves. And about Miss D. Baines, the retired postal worker with the rosebush laceration, and hoped his follow-up appointment hadn't fallen through the gaps of the transition. She had no way to know. Her employment record at Clearwater Regional was formally amended in December. No ceremony. She received a notification from the hospital's records office, attaching a document showing the removal of the fabricated performance notations, and a statement that the adverse record had been placed in error under circumstances constituting a violation of employment standards, but it twice. Then she made tea she didn't particularly want and stood at her kitchen window and looked at the lake. December in Portsmouth. The water was the color of pewter, and the sky above it was the color of old linen, and a container ship was moving slowly toward the St. Lawrence, enormous in the distance, patient. The amended record didn't give back the 8 months. It didn't give back the particular version of her professional life that she would have had if none of this had happened. She was 32, and she had a corrected record and a consulting engagement with the Department of National Defense's accountability framework. And, increasingly, Relage spoke, a working relationship with a CJOC analyst named Turner, whom she still hadn't met in person but who sent her flagged supply chain reports with a dry running commentary that she had come to depend on more than she would have predicted. She went back to clinical work in January, not at Clearwater. Then a soldier spoke. That building was still in the long process of becoming something different, and even when it emerged from receivership, it would be a different institution than the one she'd spent 6 years inside. She picked up shifts at Harborview General, 12 kilometers east along the lake, because she needed to be in a ward, or she didn't feel like herself. On her second shift, she found a discrepancy in the trauma bay supply inventory. 3 units of a specific wound packing material that should have been restocked 48 hours earlier and hadn't been. Probably a shipping delay. Probably nothing. Or not, she filed a notation in the supply management system with the item code, the expected restock date, and the current shortage quantity. Flagged it for the supply coordinator. Nurse beside her at the station watched her do it with an expression of mild assessment. You know, that's probably just a delay from the distributor, she said. Probably, Nadia said. So why log it? Because probably isn't definitely, Nadia said, and the documentation takes me 2 minutes, and it might matter to someone later. The charge nurse considered this. You're going to be one of those nurses who documents everything, aren't you? Already am, Nadia said, and moved on to her next patient, Ernie, indifferent. The lake was still visible through the window of the break room on her third shift, gray and enormous and indifferent in the way that bodies of water of that size were indifferent, and Raffles spoke. carrying on their own logic regardless of what was happening on the shore. She'd never quite lost her mild surprise at the scale of it. She'd grown up in a landlocked city, and the sheer fact of Lake Ontario still registered, after 6 years, as slightly improbable. Her phone showed a message from Turner. The Major spoke. A flagged report. 2 separate clinical officers at facilities in British Columbia had filed supply discrepancy reports in the same 8-week window, noting trauma supply restock rates inconsistent with their order records. Small variances. The kind that could be administrative lag. The kind that could be something else. He'd attached 2 words at the end. Familiar pattern? She finished her coffee. She went back to the floor. She had 4 patients to see before her shift ended, and a briefing document to read on her way home, and a report to begin drafting tonight that might matter to someone eventually. Some things ended with a commendation and a press release. Gumund spoke. This one ended with a nurse in a break room with a cold coffee, reading a flagged report on her phone and recognizing the shape of a familiar problem from a direction she hadn't looked before. It ended with a woman who had been told her work was noise deciding, again, that the work was signal. That it had always been signal. That the difference between a gap in a supply cabinet and no gap was a real difference, measured in real units owed to real people. She put her phone in her pocket and went to see her patients.